Hey class, welcome back to chapter 30. This time around, we're going to be discussing the 70s, the Nixon era, the wrap up of Vietnam. We're getting into some hippie culture, in case some of you are interested in that sort of style of fashion and lifestyle. And we're going to be sort of wrapping off with a discussion of Jimmy Carter and a little bit of U.S.-Iran relations with the Iran sort of hostage situation and the Iranian Revolution and Khomeini and sort of rise of the Middle East relations with the United States. So it should be a fun chapter. I wish I had some more That 70s Show clips to show in this sort of lecture, but if anyone is a fan of That 70s Show, also go and watch that. But we're going to be discussing four main topics today. Hippies and counterculture, which is a very sort of important deviation from past decades, from the 40s and 50s, and we'll discuss exactly how. The rise of Nixon. He had an incredible career, and in pretty much all accounts, was one of my favorite presidents in terms of like just how much he wanted to get done. And then leading into part three, the downfall of Nixon. Nobody's perfect, and he definitely sort of messed up towards the end of his presidency with the Watergate Scandal. We're going to be discussing what the Watergate Scandal was, why it was important, maybe some parallels to recent Trump administration scandals, and general sort of lessons to learn of the sort of American process and how much power the presidential branch should have. Number four. Jimmy Carter and sort of a spotlight on the Iranian Revolution because Iran is typically in the news here and there, so I thought it would be nice to get a little bit of additional context into Iran, their recent history, and why there's so much tension with the United States. So, without further ado, let's get into part one, hippies and counterculture. So, we'll just, right off the bat, to start, the video on the right-hand side. If you don't do anything else in this lecture, please just watch this video. This man is so just charismatic, and he details his life in the 60s and 70s of being a hippie. Everything from the freedom of sex to drugs to going to San Francisco in a one-way ticket and just doing whatever it is he wanted to do. And he really embodies the lifestyle and the mentality, what it truly meant to be, let's say, a hippie, or to be free, right, of any type of social norms and constructs. So a great little clip, so I highly recommend everyone watch that. But a hippie generally is, some nonconformist, unconventional type of person, has long hair, different types of, clothing, loose and baggy. They typically try to go against the conventions of society, usually taking hallucinogenic drugs. Sort of, if anyone has seen That 70s Show, the main character, one of the main, not main, but one of the sort of side characters, Leo, he always kind of comes in, sort of high out of his mind, and says, "Hey dudes, hey man, like what's going on?" Right, that kind of sort of hippie vibe. But in the late 60s and 70s, we definitely start getting a rise of the hippie movement and the counterculture movement as well. And they definitely stood for, anti-war, anti-violence, try to be counterculture. And the main culture at the time was stemming from the 40s and 50s, which was very, buttoned down, similar to, let's say, a haircut that I have, right? Like very sort of traditional type of cut. Business suits, very like World War II-esque. Everything was kind of, very buttoned down and proper. And so this was supposed to be the antithesis of that. So instead of being tied to a certain regiment of school, work, buying a house, married, kids, etc., the counterculture was going to be freedom, travel, being single, not being tied down to marriage, having promiscuous sex, not needing to be serious all the time, taking hallucinogenic drugs and opening up your mind and your chakras and your third eye. And so they really did want to kind of go against sort of the culture at the time. And boy, did they. And so this is a wonderful sort of stark example, sort of contrast that I wanted to make. So on the left-hand side would be that traditional like 40s, 50s, very like Mad Men style, button-down suits, business, corporate world, right? Clean-cut haircut. And on the right-hand side, colors, free-flowing, right? Self-expression. Just experimenting, right, with fashion and everything in between. And so, because their parents and grandparents grew up in that older generation, right, and they kept seeing war after sort of a blind following of, let's say, the government and whatever the government wanted to do, the new sort of generation of kids were looking at the situation and saying, we had World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and we're embattled in the midst of the Vietnam War right now. What does it mean to be part of the system? Do we necessarily agree to be part of the system any longer? And so there was a huge sort of counterbalance, right, from that sort of section. And so you see various, things like this. People just out on the road, free, trying not to be constrained by anything. So this is essentially, I guess, the modern equivalent, perhaps, if you want to make that comparison, to maybe someone having a gap year after college and just traveling and backpacking Europe, right? Just having no responsibility, being free, kind of just, going wherever the wind blows, right? And so it is very freeing to a certain extent, right? Here we go, the very famous make love, not money, and, like the peace sign, right? And so, yeah, the hippies were definitely a sort of blip on the radar. But I think some of the cultural values and lessons to be learned of freedom and trying to be, sort of nonconformist have definitely kind of stayed with folks. And over time, even though hippies were, kind of sprawl around the entirety of the United States at, a certain moment of time, they definitely did have a few moments and events where they met up, let's say like Woodstock and, enormous concerts. Sometimes they would have, a few exist today still, very rare, but hippie communes. Communes were these sort of, farm-like locations where, as much as they could, they tried to have no semblances of money or responsibilities or, let's say, traditional marital ties, etc. They were just free. Some communes were complete nudist communes. Things might have gotten a little weird, right? And that, people did not necessarily have to shave anymore. People let their beards grow out, their leg hair grow out, of all types of men and women and everything in between. So depending on the commune and depending how comfortable the populace was, they had like little sort of experimental pockets of society, right, all throughout the U.S. and around the world. Most of the communes just did not end up working out because, just economically wise, you need money, you need food, you need to grow things. So unless they somehow figured out to purchase the land 100% outright and leave money for, let's say, property taxes, etc., and then be fully self-sufficient on money, food, water, and all the electricity and whatever else they needed to, most of the communes ended up sort of not working out and shutting down. But I guess, if you joined a commune for a year or two, could have been the best experiences of your life. Woodstock. Everyone keeps hearing about Woodstock, and if you do watch that 70s show, they keep like remembering Woodstock here and there as well. And so this is a primary source example from Glenn Weiser talking about his experiences at Woodstock. And so he, goes to say that there was, very large crowds, some semblance of the festival ground or where everyone was supposed to be. Everyone was allowed in for free. There was a lot of LSD, a lot of drugs, moonshine, galore. Whatever you wanted to take, it was there. Tasty black hashish, acid, music everywhere. It was just, that type of just wonderful summer of complete carefreeness, and everyone just going for the music and, trying to, dance and, release their minds, right? The festival was absolutely enormous, with more and more people coming. I believe it was at around maybe 100,000 strong, something like that, maybe a little more. And so it was definitely, I think, the pinnacle of the hippie movement at Woodstock. After that, it was a little bit of a sort of downtrend over time as like the hippies kind of dispersed throughout the U.S. But this was the most, I think, like largest festival that they ended up sort of mustering. And I put a couple of videos here with counterculture, anti-war, freedom of self-expression, just to kind of give a little bit of a backdrop and maybe a slight explanation on the hippie culture, right, and where some of these things and ideas came from, right? I believe the video on the right-hand side details like some interview with a couple of them, trying to maybe just give you a little bit of a snippet of their mindset. Now, if you do go on YouTube and just type in Woodstock, there'll be videos, performances. You know, you could really kind of just watch and see what the time frame was, right, and what the timeline was, and sort of the vibe at that time. Like the OG Coachella, except a lot more hallucinogenic drugs for sure. This is a slightly longer form documentary. So if you have the time, so sitting at 28 minutes long, you can definitely watch it. But they do go through many interviews and kind of detail exactly what the sort of hippie movement was, where they got a lot of their ideas. They wanted to go and be more anti-conformist against, let's say, their parents and sort of the suits back in the day. And so if you have the time for it, not necessary. This is a nice little documentary thing that I found. And so, have at it. This is a fun little slide that I wanted to do. Hopefully no one is going to have some type of, trip when it comes to seeing this. If you do, immediately fast forward. I don't want anyone to get to be on the floor with like too much lights and things moving up. But if anyone is interested in music, or listening to some quote-unquote hippie type of music, or from some music back in the day, or something very similar to what they would be listening to if they were just smoking weed and just lounging about, here's a playlist I found on Spotify. The link is here on the bottom. And so that type of 60s, 70s music style, in case you are interested and wondering what some of them might be listening to, I just wanted to kind of add that in. And I made this whole graphics thing because I thought it would just sort of match the aesthetic and the vibe. But don't worry, I did not partake in any hallucinogenic drugs in making of that slide. Or did I? The world will never know. Yes, but part 2, getting more into governmental history, I suppose, with the rise of Nixon. Before we do that, let's just close off on hippies. So the main lesson to be learned on hippies and counterculture is it was more of a few year / decade-ish long experiment in social sort of conduct. I think ultimately they were not successful in, making an entire movement like they wanted to do around the world, because it's not really something you can base real world life on. You need to work, you need to make money, you need to produce, right? You cannot just infinitely share resources and then think that things are going to be okay, right? Because no one is producing and everyone is just high out of their minds. But certain elements I think are beneficial to learn from the hippies, because the idea of counterculture, trying to not take the government for their word on every single thing that they tell you, right? Trying to have your own mind, your own viewpoint and opinions. That's definitely an important thing to sort of hold on and continue. The usage of hallucinogenic drugs, I think, is something that it could be a little bit of overkill, but in certain areas, such as pharmaceutical industries, I think that they should probably do a little bit more studies, because there are recent studies that have been coming out with, let's say, very light sort of LSD or acid-like trips, or usage of maybe mushrooms or marijuana usage, etc., that are a little bit more of a medicinal, healthier version of treating some like ailments and mental disorders, etc., in the modern day than, let's say, giving you like some hard pharmaceutical drugs and then just keeping you on that, which kind of turns you into like a zombie-like state. So I wish they would do a little more research on that, because if someone just had to take like some light weed or a little mushroom here and there to like deal with some, you know, issues that they're having in whatever form, versus just hardcore pharmaceutical drugs, then probably that, you know, maybe might benefit a lot of folks. And so ultimately, I think that the hippies have, you know, some things definitely to teach us as a movement itself, not long lasting, but some things are good to learn from them, such as not taking authority for their word 100% of the time. All right, so let's get into Nixon, Mr. Good old Richard Nixon. I am not a crook. This man was seen and, you know, came into the scene as the sort of conservative rebirth of America. He was, excuse me, he was, you know, sort of aligning himself with the conservatives, with the Republicans. You know, the Democrats were sort of reeling back against some of their, you know, tactics and politics. And so he came in, you know, first off as vice president, and he lost against John F. Kennedy when we were doing our JFK section in the last chapter or two, during that sort of televised routine where whoever was watching TV thought that Nixon lost because they just saw the glamour and the handsomeness of JFK and his charisma. But after that, he came back and actually won the presidency from 69 to 74. Now, he was, above all else, known as a very smart, calculating, and being a shrewd politician. He knew how to play the game, and he played the game very well. And so as soon as he came in, for the most part, his domestic and foreign policy, outright, in my opinion, was fantastic. He wanted essentially to increase the domestic policies of his predecessors, Eisenhower, Truman, LBJ, and to try to expand, let's say, freedoms in the U.S. and to help out, you know, the poor or anyone less fortunate. Foreign policy-wise, he had a very strong U.S. policy, and he wanted to open up relations with numerous countries, etc. So overall, very successful. Like he had a very good, successful presidency, and we're going to detail a lot of that stuff right now. Let's see. As far as the EPA, he was actually the first one that built the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Without that, companies were just dumping unholy amounts of chemicals and pollutants into, you know, the water supply. And so, you know, he was, you know, sort of the creator of this, because he understood very well that companies cannot just dump whatever they want to into the ecosystem and there will be no repercussions. So that was part of his domestic policy, right? To try to make things as better as, you know, humanly possible. And so after being sworn in to the presidency, you know, Nixon did a pretty darn good, fantastic job, right? Sort of navigating the role of the presidency in the executive branch in both the domestic and foreign policy spectrum. And honestly, he was pretty beloved by both sides. I know that the Republicans and the conservatives wanted him to be more fiscally conservative and not have as many of the sort of LBJ style Great Society sort of safety nets for people. But, you know, he was sort of beloved by both sides. And he, you know, became very popularized on news magazines, right? He was definitely sort of, you know, in that sort of, you know, caliber of sort of being liked by both sides. So even though the conservative sector did not necessarily like the idea of him still having more progressive viewpoints and ideologies, you know, they were still happy because he was, you know, one of their own. And, you know, he kind of, once again, because he was a shrewd politician, he played both sides, and he was sort of liked enough by, you know, both sides in order to be reelected. His welfare programs, very famous, ended up giving more aid to dependent children, children in foster care, family assistance programs, to be like a huge safety net, right? If, let's say, they needed some money to start off, their families, wanting to help and give more money to lower no income individuals, began affirmative action in his years to promote greater employment and education opportunities for minorities. So within the first 3 years of Nixon implementing affirmative action, black student attendance rose from 32 to 77%. So the hope was the more minorities that would go to school, right? Eventually they're going to graduate, which means the more of them are going to get into the job market, which means that the sort of general population of that ethnic group is going to rise and continue. Now, the long-term effectiveness of affirmative action in today's standards is now being questioned and potentially on the table for getting sort of taken off. So the main idea was that affirmative action for a decade, two, might have worked, but now it's sort of being utilized negatively in the spectrum of academia or in the spectrum of sort of trying to sort of equalize student attendance without sort of as much merit-based. And so they're still having a debate about that, whether you're liberal or conservative on that side. But the conservatives and the moderates are not liking affirmative action as much anymore. The much more progressive and liberals are still holding on to affirmative action. But my guess is that as we're going to be moving forward in the next few years, 10, 20 years, especially because we have a conservative Supreme Court now, my guess is that affirmative action would be on the chopping block. And so that's just my sort of guess. So we'll kind of see how that ends up going out. Court nominations. Nixon was actually having a very successful time as U.S. president, because as U.S. president, you would hope that maybe one or two of your Supreme Court folks are going to be retiring, so you could have a lot more power and trying to get some Supreme Court nominees in there. But 3 is a lot, right? Usually maybe presidents have 1, maybe 2. He had 3. I believe that Donald Trump also ended up having 3, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe, yes, I believe also. So it's a huge amount of power. Hold on. Okay. And so the main point here is that the executive branch does have the power to nominate Supreme Court members as soon as they pass away or retire. And so it is one of the greatest powers that a sitting president does have, because we only have 3 branches of government: the executive branch, legislative, and judicial. And so the fact that the U.S. president alone can just pick Supreme Court nominees from the pool of judges around the country is an enormous sort of power to have. And you can shape politics for decades, right? Because you're going to be shaping whatever policies they're going to be doing. Let's see. Swan v. Board of Education. This one was an interesting one. So this is after Brown v. Board of Education, and Brown v. Board, the previous the previous Supreme Court act that they did, said that you can no longer segregate. And so Swan v. Board now says that, in terms of, busing students to promote integration into, public schools, they essentially were, saying that, yes, we can start doing that. And so for a period of time, in order to promote that reintegration of the sort of races of white and black, they started to bus whites into black neighborhoods and blacks into white neighborhoods in terms of schooling, right? To sort of have that forced intermixing, right? And integration. And so a lot of white parents ended up having a backlash to this, because they started to move into the suburbs away from the inner schools, so that their kids did not have to attend the schools with the African American children. So this particular case ended up having large ramifications in terms of geographical sort of population movements. And so what we ended up having is that the city center ended up losing a lot of their white population and retaining a lot of the immigrant minority populations, if you will. And the whites started to move more and more into the suburbs, right? And so caused a big population shift there. And it did start the conversation of reverse discrimination, especially in terms of affirmative action. And that's the thing that I was talking about last time, about a slide or two ago, with affirmative action. So this reverse discrimination began, this thought process began when affirmative action started and has continued even today. Perhaps today it's even a little bit stronger, because the idea is that affirmative action programs, or those pro-policy programs, discriminate against people of white orientation. Now, this viewpoint is going to depend upon your political stance and your world viewpoints. But typically, let's say, one stance would be that affirmative action is needed because the minority communities are not represented as much in education, and so we have to forcefully have a reintegration and get those numbers up. The other side viewpoint would be that education should not be forced, right, in that regard. It should be merit-based. So if you want to get into Harvard, for example, you need to have Harvard-level grades, right, and to really kind of push yourself academically and be sort of worthy of getting into the school. It should not be checking a few boxes and saying, I am X, Y, and Z, ethnicity, X, or whatever, and so I'm going to get in with much lower sort of grades and expectations there just to meet diversity quotas. And so there's those two stances, take it as you will. But like I said before, affirmative action and this type of conversation, I think, is going to be on the chopping block soon, or at least up for debate and discussion with the new sort of Supreme Court turnouts. But everyone initially was not very happy with busing, that sort of reintegration busing of students, right, everywhere. And so numerous rallies for education, and the busing was definitely causing various issues. And like I said, it started to cause this massive migration of people from the inner cities away into the suburbs, especially of the white population, thus creating that sort of even more so, I suppose, that white suburbia, type of, look. Moving on into more, let's say, foreign policy-wise. So as Nixon tried to do his best in terms of sort of internals of the U.S., right? He was definitely handed a lot of issues that the U.S. still has, as any sitting U.S. president does. But coming into, let's say, foreign policy abroad, Nixon did not have something like JFK had in terms of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was nothing as horrifically dangerous as that with nuclear warfare, but he definitely wanted to, progress with the Soviet Union and China and sort of that capitalism versus communism fight and debate around the world, that chess game, as I like to call it, with poise. Now, conservatives, or the more war hawk type of individuals in Congress and in politics, viewed Nixon's foreign policy as being a little soft on communism and not aggressive enough. But Nixon does not just want to try to steamroll the other powers, because that's not going to, be as fruitful. And so, he still continued a lot of the policies that his predecessors did with trying to play the long game in terms of different world powers and territories, such as Iran, the Philippines, Africa, Latin America, So instead of actually going up against the Soviets or China, you're going up against proxy states or proxy territories in order to have as many allies as possible. And so the two biggest communistic states at the time were the Soviet Union and China. They were the largest two nations, and they were both communistic. Of course, various other states around the world, the smaller ones were trying to maybe experiment here and there, but for the most part, those are the two biggest players. And so Nixon was trying to figure out a good strategic way of potentially deteriorating Soviet-Chinese relations to not make them as close, and for the United States to come in and maybe be a little closer, have better relations with one of them, or hopefully both. And so he ended up having this sort of ingenious idea where he would be trying to get more friendly with China, and that would force the Soviets to try to be a little more pro-America, right? So they did not want to lose China as an ally and as a communistic partner. And so Nixon inadvertently was sort of forcing the Soviets' hand, not by like true force, but by diplomacy, in order for them to be a little more lenient, right, and try to open up dialogue. And so if you could imagine, at this point in time, like 1971, 1972, for decades, no U.S. president has set foot in China or the Soviet Union, and has had only hardball, sort of hardline, no's when it comes to dealing with those countries because they're communistic and they're not capitalism, right? They were very hard against it. Nixon was the first one to open up talks, open up diplomacy, and he actually was the first sitting U.S. president for many, many decades to visit both China and the Soviet Union. So if you could imagine yourself being an average American reader, and you're reading that, oh, the U.S. president is visiting China. He's visiting the Soviet Union and shaking hands and talking to them and opening up relations and borders and trade or whatever. You're just like, whoa, your mind is blown. Like, the relations are really opening up again. And so he visited Beijing and Shanghai and a few other locations, and I'll show some photographs in a second. So this was seen as an enormously astonishing event, but that chess game that he was playing was working. Because China started becoming a little bit more pro-U.S. They started opening up trade. And thus, because of that, the Soviet Union was going to be next in his line of touring that region. And the Soviets were going to be a little nicer, right? And so in 1972, once he started to speak to the Soviets, they initiated SALT, or agreeing to limit the quantity of nuclear weapons that both sides had. So now, up till the 60s and 70s, both powers were, trying to get as much nuclear weapons as humanly possible, right? And now we're actually seeing the reverse, them actually trying to lower the amount of warheads. So Nixon is being successful, right, in this endeavor. Here are a couple videos of him visiting China and the Soviet Union. Definitely worth to watch, just to kind of see the historic moments, right, that people were seeing on their televisions. And it is definitely, great parts of history to sort of review. Him shaking hands with the actual premiers of China at the time. So like I said, his foreign policy was definitely sort of radical at the time. On the right-hand side, him walking with the Soviet premiers, with the Soviet Red Army and choir right there. This is just unheard of in previous decades, right? Like, other U.S. presidents would have been rolling in their graves thinking, like, what, a U.S. president visiting the communists? What the heck is going on here? But Nixon saw this as a way to de-escalate tensions around the world. And so, it was overall a positive, I believe. This is one of the most famous type of photos and events that I could imagine. It was sprawled all around and printed all around, like magazines and newspapers everywhere. So the U.S. president walking on the Great Wall of China, right? It was just a crazy, crazy moment in time, and just demonstrated and showed that the Nixons, right, husband and wife here, were truly that sort of go-getter New Age couple, New Age politician, right, that was going and trying to repair relations. So definitely, he was paving a name for himself. A famous photo here of the introduction dinner in Shanghai with the sort of premieres of China. And so I can tell Nixon here is probably looking at his chopsticks thinking like, how in the hell am I going to use chopsticks? They were probably, teaching him beforehand how to use it, but I think it was might have been a new experience for him. But, sitting down over food, eating, trying to build good relations, that's how business is done. And of course with the Soviets, later on during his visit to the Soviet Union, there's Brezhnev there with his big furry eyebrows. And so, having the de-escalation talks, right, in terms of nuclear weapons and such, right, signing various agreements, which was, once again, sort of unheard of in previous years. And so, yeah, Nixon was definitely having a fantastic lead up, right, up until now. Here's a couple videos of sort of his timeline and the short little histories of Nixon, right, and, his sort of time there. The one on the left-hand side, the video, is only a few minutes long, so it kind of details and caps, a lot of his, accomplishments very well. And the video on the right-hand side is a pretty long 50-minute documentary. If you are very interested in Nixon and this time of U.S. history, you can feel free to watch that. Not necessary, but it's there if you need it. And so hopefully it can give you a little bit more insight and context and a little bit, kind of deeper understanding of Nixon and everything that was going on in that day and age. Oh, these ones are fantastic. So we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War, wrapping up and concluding in a second. But in terms of foreign policy, Nixon was definitely also embroiled in the Vietnam War. Now, people tend to forget that it's not just Nixon's Vietnam War. It was kind of starting off with JFK / Eisenhower, and then progressing with Johnson, and of course, kind of moving forward with Nixon as well. So for a few presidencies, the U.S. was escalating more and more and more in the Vietnam War. Nixon was the last president, so he started to get the troops out of Vietnam. And so he, finally was just pulling the painful plug on the operation. But the Vietnam War, was a very sort of long, aggressive, costly, bloody war. And it was seen as such a, bad war just in general. And we'll talk about that in a second with some of the protests stuff coming up. But here's a couple of videos detailing, why America fought in the Vietnam War in the beginning. And then especially the video on the right-hand side. I love this video of this gentleman over here. So he is a Vietnam veteran detailing in fantastic fashion, over 15 minutes. He's a great storyteller of what it was like to be recruited and drafted, what it was like there, what lies they were telling the troops there in terms of what they're doing, what he actually saw the reality being, and the experiences of coming back home after, serving your country and having like rocks and rotten fruit thrown at you by American citizens telling you that you're horrible. And so it's a very interesting sort of experience that he kind of details here. So I recommend everybody to watch. It gives you the perspective of one of the soldiers at that time. And so up until now, Nixon's presidency, for the most part, domestically, pretty good, right? Creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, affirmative action, expanding family plan programs, etc., right? He was trying to be a good domestic president. Foreign policy-wise, trying to break down the ice of the Cold War relations with both China and the Soviet Union. And even though the U.S. is still embroiled in Vietnam, he is slowly trying to de-escalate the situation and pull troops out of Vietnam and end the war, which eventually he did. And so on paper, and for the most part, right, a fantastic president. Now, we're going to be slowly entering into the end of the Vietnam War and how Americans were perceiving it and how that affects Nixon's presidency. And also the single greatest mess up that Nixon did in his presidency, which was Watergate. And I believe this is kind of equal to life itself, right? Whenever you are doing so many good things in your life, but then you do one horrible thing, people tend to remember the horrible thing and forget the other many good things that you've done. So unfortunately, this thing, the Watergate scandal, is forever just seared into the memory of Nixon, right? Historically speaking, to so many people. And they tend to forget his wonderful track record up until now. So, Nixon's Vietnam. So, as Vietnam was raging on, and the U.S. was obviously embroiled in it, Nixon starts to implement or really ramp up what is called Vietnamization, which is essentially withdrawing U.S. troops and equipping, expanding, and training the South Vietnamese forces. Now, the main reason this is important is because, similar to the situation in modernly in Iraq, Afghanistan, right, those regions of the world, the U.S. comes in very strong, right, kind of fights, destroys things, whatever, and sets itself up as being like the policeman in the region. But then what happens when they leave? There's a power vacuum. Who's going to be in charge? And so that power vacuum is very dangerous. It could lead to rebel groups. It could lead to other powers coming in and taking control, whatever. And so here they wanted to train the South Vietnamese, or the capitalistic version of Vietnam. North Vietnam was the communistic part. And so they wanted to train them so that they could, take over. And the U.S. could just leave. Easier said than done. Spoiler alert. After the U.S. withdrew, the South Vietnamese actually were not strong enough to contain North Vietnam, and Vietnam ended up being conquered by North Vietnamese, and is still communistic today. But the sort of regime that was following, the Khmer Rouge, also was a thorn in his side. So as they were, let's say, as the Americans were dealing with Vietnam, over in Cambodia, a nearby country in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Rouge were sort of another communistic party rebel group that was having their roots in Cambodia. Now, this was difficult for Nixon to try to ascertain what to do. The reason being is because even though you're fighting the North Vietnamese, right, just in Vietnam, the country has a lot of other South Asian countries sort of connected to it, and there's a lot of trade and forests and etc. So the Khmer Rouge through Cambodia was secretly supplying the North Vietnamese with a lot of troops and supplies and guns and ammunition and stuff. And so Nixon begrudgingly kind of sent troops and bombers to bomb the Khmer Rouge complexes in Cambodia, which the U.S. is not at war with. And so this actually resulted in chaos through Cambodia. It started to cause a lot of the local Cambodians to actually go to the Khmer Rouge to sign up and enlist as more freedom fighters. Cambodia itself as a government started getting pissed off at the U.S. because they were just entering into their airspace and territory and bombing stuff without their permission. And so it was just, at the time when the U.S. needs to cool down things in Vietnam, it seemed that for a certain time things were actually ramping up in terms of intensity. And so due to all of this, the anti-war college protests were starting. And this is one of the reasons why Nixon's legacy started to become worse and worse. Because his relation with Vietnam, or people's perception that like Nixon equals Vietnam and vice versa, so many colleges were protesting against the Vietnam War, especially because at a certain moment in time, the U.S. was just running out of volunteers for the Vietnam War because nobody actually understood the main reasons why we were going there, and believing, well, what the hell did the Vietnamese ever do to us? Why do we need to go halfway around the world to fight? This is not us fighting the Russians. This is just a random place in the world. Like, this doesn't make sense to us. And so the United States implemented the military draft. Men 18 to 25, I believe. Yeah, 18 to 25 were drafted. And so students, mainly college students, because you're within the 18 to 25 range, they were protesting heavily in hundreds of colleges, and even troops had to be sent in on numerous campuses in order to rile down the protests. But the protesters and their families and friends, they were all heavily against the war, because they didn't want to be sent off to die. Here's some footage on the left-hand side. I believe it was CBS. Yeah, CBS sent a camera crew in 1970 with a platoon that actually came under fire. So interesting to watch there for primary footage of what it was like to sort of enter into Vietnam. And on the right-hand side, we have, this is I don't know exactly how to describe this, but I'll try my best. This is a great sort of series of footage. So in the beginning here, it starts off with one or two Vietnam vets actually talking about their experiences in Vietnam. And exactly, how many of their friends died and platoon numbers died, etc. And then it kind of goes through in details random people, right, throughout the U.S. kind of giving their perspective on the Vietnam War. And it gives you a nice overall perspective of what Americans were thinking of during the Vietnam War. Saying, like, yes, I'm a patriot, but I don't want my son to go off to war. For a war that I don't really believe needs to be fought, right? Like, they're giving these interesting perspectives. Very interesting to watch if you do have the time. Here's a couple more. The video on the left-hand side details student protests, and they got violent at times. Like tear gas, troops, police had to be come in on numerous, college campuses. Really a difficult time in a lot of the campuses. So whatever protests you think you might be having now, at least the troops are not coming in with guns to try to force you to join the draft. And so, yeah, things were getting a little heated at the time, just to say the least. And so, yeah, things got a little bit crazy on some of the campuses. Muhammad Ali, very famous, very vocal in a lot of his, interviews and stuff. Also was detailing his objection to the Vietnam War, why he did not want to sort of join the war himself and enlist. And so a great also snippet of media and television at the time, because he was on the Dick Cavett show. Which was a very good, popular interview show at the time. And so it gives you a wonderful sort of understanding of, the wartime effort and what peaceful objectors, what kind of stances they had and why. So the student protesters, this guy over here, I don't know why, it looks like a tall version of Daniel Radcliffe, Harry Potter over here. Just put a scar on him and boom, he's Harry Potter right there. But Harry Potter over here, has his Vietnam for the Vietnamese, let's get out sign, right? Protesters. And so respect the Geneva Code. War erodes the great society, right? People just don't want to go over there and start fighting and bombing anymore. Get the hell out of Vietnam. And so, yeah, people are just not wanting to be part of this anymore. And this is also happening around the same time as the hippie counterculture movement, which is important to note because in past years, let's say the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, people were taught that authority is correct, your parents are correct, the school board is correct, government is correct, the police are correct, and so you are taught to follow along. And so whenever we had World War I, World War II, the Korean War, they told you we have to go here and it's for a good reason. And people are like, okay, cool, let's do it. I'm a patriot and I agree. By the time we start getting to the Vietnam War, that counterculture starts to really kind of set in, regardless of whether people are hippies or not, but inadvertently the society just ends up evolving and changing. And so, people start to really sort of question authority. People start to question, does the government have our best interest at heart? What is our role in Vietnam? What is our role in fighting halfway across the world? And so it really does have a profound change, and people are heavily protesting now in the government's involvement, right? And they start to, I believe this is the beginning of a sort of large disconnect where instead of people viewing the U.S., the sort of American population, as the government, right, and them being one and the same, now they're viewing them as separate. The American public is now separate from the U.S. government, right? And so that is a very big distinction that I think is being made at this point in time, and even up to today, right, in modern days. That idea has, I think, become even more and more prevalent, right? People just feel more disconnected by the government and their actions than ever before, when it never used to be like that in, older decades. Another example of protests and sit-ins, and the police kind of being called in for just controlling and containing the situation. But all across the U.S., protests were everywhere. Gas canisters. I mean, this guy, look at the right hook on him. Throwing back that gas canister is just right back at the police, just yeeting that thing across the field. And so, yeah, the protests were getting interesting because the students were having, nonviolent, peaceful protests here. And, the school boards were calling the police in, and sometimes troops, in order to enact, drafts and make sure that they're going back to class. And the end of the Vietnam War. So, 73, Nixon ended up achieving what his predecessors could not, a negotiated settlement of getting us the heck out of Vietnam. So during a Paris Peace Conference, they were finally negotiating how and when the troops are going to leave. The end result, like I said before, however, is even though the American troops were trying to train the South Vietnamese to be self-sufficient, they were not strong enough to go up against North Vietnam/Chinese resources together. And so as the U.S. pulled out, there was that inevitable power vacuum, and South Vietnam was eventually defeated by North Vietnam, creating the still communist country that it is today. And so overall, it was considered a major military defeat within U.S. history because we had 58,000 Americans killed, a very large number, 3 to 4 Vietnamese, 3 to 4 million Vietnamese killed. And most importantly, the American public's trust in the government was now shaken, like I said before. Instead of blindly following authority, now we are questioning authority. Instead of the American public thinking that the government is part of American fabric and society, now we are viewing it as separate, right? A separate entity. And so, the war overall was seen as a defeat. We did not necessarily achieve any type of victory there. We did not stop communism from spreading because Vietnam eventually became communistic anyways. And we just wasted troops and lives and resources. One of my old professors from UCLA during my undergrad, he was a fantastic professor. His name was Langdon, teaching ancient Roman history, but he was an ex-Vietnam veteran. And so he made a very good point on the War of Vietnam, saying, why did America lose? Because look at the numbers here. 58,000 Americans killed, but 3 to 4 million Vietnamese. From those numbers, you would be imagining, well, the Americans are, winning, right? Because they're losing a lot less troops than the enemy, right? And things are going well. But he made a very important point. He said that you can never win against a nation that has unlimited manpower because, to us, it is a foreign war and we're kind of just sending troops there, here and there. To them, they are fighting tooth and nail for their homeland. So they will throw as many people as need be to protect their homeland. And so he said, inevitably, we were never going to win. Same thing, I believe, can be said for, let's say, Afghanistan or any other territories we're in for long periods of time. When the populace truly does not want us there, they will fight tooth and nail for decades and bleed us dry of resources. And inevitably, we're going to have to leave anyways, and it causes a defeat for the U.S. because our objectives are not met, whatever they may be. And so that kind of transitions into the lessons to be learned category that I want to go over here. What the hell was the reason of us getting into Vietnam? Did we have clear long-term goals in mind? No, we did not. Numerous sergeants and higher military staff of the Vietnam War were actually saying the exact same thing. They're like, we don't know exactly what the finalized goals were supposed to be. It eventually leads to the U.S. being bled financially because war is very expensive, extremely costly. And so you're going to be losing an unholy amounts of money there. It leads to troop morale decay, which is not very good because you do not want your troops to start losing their, morale and high spirits. And ultimately, the American public starts becoming very wary of war. Over time, if the war is not quick, concise, does not have clear objectives of what we're supposed to do, people start to have their patriotism worn away and fade, right? Because it just becomes like this sort of war on the sidelines. I even remember when I was, when I was in elementary school myself, September 11th happened, and then the entire Iraq, Afghanistan wars were begun under George W. Bush. And, at the very beginning, the first 2 weeks after 9/11, I even remember, there was a huge influx of patriotism, right? And people were signing up and enlisting for the war. And then as the years drew on, there was no, very concise strategy of what to do. And it just turned into the U.S. being in a protracted quasi-war, kind of, for 20 plus years. It was just dragging on and on and on. What was the clear goals there? And the American public just started being very wary of war and really not understanding what our priorities there are. So very similar results here. So my recommendation would be, if the U.S. needs to go to war again, which, I always hope there's no war in the world, but, there always is. I'm a historian. There's always war and death and destruction as far as humanity is concerned. But so the next time the U.S. needs to go to war, I would probably recommend, if I was a military advisor, make it very short, concise, know exactly what our goals are. And if our goals are not being met, or we're being bled dry of money and we're not getting the results we need, pull out. There has to be a balanced cost sort of analysis there. And so Nixon finally was able to end the Vietnam War. However, although he ended the Vietnam War, his reputation was still tarnished a bit because of the drafts, right? And because of the situation. Now, most Americans were smart enough at the time to understand that it's not Nixon's fault, and necessarily he's not the one who got us in there. He finally ended the war, so that was a great little bonus. But that's still kind of worn up against Nixon at the time, because as the anti-war rhetoric was really kind of ramping up, that's when Nixon was in the presidency. So inadvertently his legacy was being kind of tainted a little bit. But this was the nail in the coffin, the Watergate scandal. I believe if the Watergate scandal did not happen, and we ended things in the previous slide of the ending of the Vietnam War, and then let's say it was smooth sailing from there, I believe Nixon would have been regarded as one of the best presidents of the 20th century, honestly speaking. His record was pretty spectacular up until that point. And so Watergate happened. So he was in charge for one term. He wanted re-election for a second term. I don't know what possessed him to do this, but he gave the green light to a number of his men going into the Democratic Party's apartment complex in Washington, D.C., their headquarters, to bug the office and to try to listen in and get as much information as possible so that they could win the next U.S. election. And this was crossing the line, right, entirely of U.S. politics and demeanor and conduct. Because now you are a U.S. president who is interfering in U.S. elections, right, and trying to sway those elections to benefit you. And so that was, whether they were Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, moderates in between, across the spectrum of politics of the U.S., everyone said pretty much in a unified voice, oh, hell no, right? And they were not going to stand for this. And so, later on, the Pentagon Papers, very sort of a big leak, was revealing how, this was happening around the same time. Pentagon Papers was sort of like the Snowden version by Mr. Ellsberg back in the day, revealing how the U.S. government and the presidents were misleading the American public about the Vietnam War. It was not going as well as it should have, so people were like, what? They've been lying to us all of these years? The War Powers Pact in 1973, was now requiring congressional approval before a president could send troops abroad, which is a very good thing. Because they wanted to limit the power that a U.S. president wanted to have in terms of war. So certain things were kind of picking up, right, in terms of looking at the presidency and seeing if the presidency and the executive branch was having too much power already. So the Pentagon Papers came out and said that numerous presidents had lied about the war People still said, fine, Nixon's not entirely to blame for that. He just inherited the Vietnam War. War Powers Act, okay, once again, not Nixon who did this entirely, but we're still looking at the presidency and saying that the president cannot just like send troops wherever they want to. They need to ask Congress for permission. Fine, we're trying to rebalance things. And for whatever reason that possessed him, whether it was hubris, ego, I don't know, Nixon sent his men to break into the Democratic Party headquarters and to bug the whole place, right? And they got caught. And he essentially was interfering in U.S. elections. Now, the way they got caught was hilarious. A random janitor just saw like lights in the DNC office, and he thought it was a burglary. And so he called the police, and then the police came and arrested them, and it just spiraled out of control. So the janitor is the MVP of all of this, I suppose. But this entire situation just got so out of hand. And there was a lot of parallels between this and the Trump administration in terms of the impeachment process, how much power they're having, interference, etc. It was similar in many regards. But here, so essentially what ended up happening was Congress started opening up hearings to go over the evidence of the wiretapping, the break-in, the sabotaging political opponents to gain the presidency, right, re-election, all of that stuff. They ordered Nixon to hand over any documents, tapes, whatever he had, in order to make this determination. Now, here is where Nixon came in and where the Supreme Court came in. So after Congress asks for this information for their investigation, Nixon says, no, I am not going to give you this because I have something called executive privilege. He used that term. And executive privilege is not necessarily engraved in stone in the U.S. Constitution, but it's sort of an implied power of executive privilege that has been used before. And so it's an implied power because, the U.S. president cannot just be randomly bombarded by like rumors and speculations and all of this random stuff while they're president, right? You have work to do. You have very important work to do on a daily basis. And so the veil of executive privilege is there. So that small, meaningless little stuff can just like not really affect you, right? You're kind of immune from prosecution and immune from a lot of stuff, so you can just focus on your job. Now, he used executive privilege here, right, as this sort of shield against having this hearing. And so now the start of the conversation of, okay, how far can a sitting U.S. president use executive privilege in order to protect themselves while in office? Are they entirely immune or not? And where is that line drawn? So the Congress asked the U.S. Supreme Court to get involved and to ask them, well, what is the line, right? Can we force a president to give us the documents, etc.? And so, eventually the U.S. Supreme Court, actually sided with Congress and forced Nixon to give over any information or tapes or whatever he had. And so the clear sort of lesson to be learned here is that executive privilege does have limits, and Nixon did use abuse here for political gain and for political power purposes. And so closely after that situation occurred, I believe I'm trying to remember what the case was called. I think it was U.S. versus Nixon or Nixon versus U.S., something around there, where it was the official U.S. Supreme Court case that said that he cannot use executive privilege entirely as a shield. He has to give up the information to Congress, et cetera, et cetera. So very quickly after that, he gave up a lot of the information he had, the documents he had, et cetera, which were very incriminating. And Congress started the impeachment process. And so Nixon's not dumb. Like we said before, he is a very shrewd, tactful politician. And he has friends on Capitol Hill as well because of his years of fantastic service with domestic and foreign and abroad issues. And so the writing was pretty much on the wall that he was going to be impeached, right? And being the first U.S. president to actually be fully impeached and kicked out of office. So what does Nixon do before the firestorm comes to his front door and fires him essentially? He resigns. the first U.S. president to ever resign. And so he resigns his position, and his vice president, Gerald R. Ford, goes into the presidency. And so Nixon goes off on his helicopter and just flies away into retirement. And of course, what happens after that? The new president, President Ford, gives a full pardon to Richard Nixon. And a presidential pardon is pretty powerful. It can protect you from federal prosecution, right? And it just wipes the slate clean of your potential guilt or whatever else. So this gave Nixon essentially a free pass. He's not going to jail. And they cannot come after him. And so most Americans, when they saw this situation happen, they essentially had their jaw dropped, and they're like, dude, come on, really? You're giving him a full pardon immediately after this? This is just corruption 101. And so, I mean, you be the judge. Was Nixon such a good president that he did make a mistake at the end, and Ford wanted to forgive him because he did so much service for his country? It would not be fair for him to go to jail. Or, is no man above the law? And even though he did so much good for the country, he did slip up at the end, and he needed to be held accountable, and some repercussions should have happened. You be the judge of that. But yeah, Nixon's life story is definitely interesting. I did want to give a little bit of an example here. I did want to give an example here of some famous war movies that have been inspired over time in terms of the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War occurred during this highlight of U.S. culture in terms of music, the rise of the movie industry, 70s, 80s, 90s movies, like all those war movies and Rambo and Schwarzenegger and all those types, and moving on after that as well. And so there's this cult following of the Vietnam War in this era, right? Like movies like Forrest Gump, Rambo, We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, fantastic. On the bottom right-hand corner, I put Tropic Thunder as a comedic satire point as well, because it was sort of like based on the Vietnam War as well. But, so many other films that were, sort of utilizing this time period, right? And so the Vietnam War definitely has long legs to it, even today. Some movies and films and books still come out about this time. And for good reason. It was such an enormous part of sort of U.S. culture and history at the time. Come on. Okay. This was a important thing to note also before Nixon resigned from office. And this kind of goes, and I put this at the end of the slides because I wanted this to kind of be a little closer to the Middle East section that we're going to be talking about. But as the 70s are, brewing along, and we're going to be going into the 80s and whatnot, the U.S. starts to get into a bit of a pickle. So the U.S. was seeing its manufacturing balance shift. So by 1971, the U.S. was, for the first time, in a trade deficit. So if we remember, like World War II era and onwards, the U.S. was producing an unholy amount of goods. We were strong. The U.S. dollar was the currency of the world. And so now things are starting to shift a little bit. And so by 1980, the rest of the world has gotten back on their feet a bit and starts to manufacture more. And so by 1980, nearly 3/4 of all goods produced in the U.S. were now competing with foreign-made goods and products, right? U.S. manufacturing workers fell from 38 to 28%. And so demographics were shifting, business was shifting, and so the U.S. is slowly shifting from being a manufacturing nation to a consumer nation. And today, we're pretty much a fully consumer nation. Yes, we produce in the U.S., but no longer on the level that we used to, right? Pretty much you pick up anything in your room right now. I challenge you. Pick up almost anything in your room. Look at the bottom. It says made in where? USA? No. It's made in China, made in Japan, made in Vietnam. Like, we've outsourced a lot of our production elsewhere. But this had negative repercussions with economic stagnation because the U.S. dollar was becoming stagnant. and inflation was still going up. And so wages were a little stagnant. The economy was sort of getting in a bit of a slump. It didn't help that in the early 70s and later 80s, the Middle East was starting oil embargoes on the U.S. because of some issues we were having with Egypt, Syria, Israel, Iran later on, etc. And so due to a couple of those oil embargoes, the U.S. not doing as great as it could be, let's say in terms of inflation and wage growth, Nixon ended up taking the U.S. off of the gold standard, fixing the dollar amount of the dollar in terms of gold. And so this has had enormous ramifications. I personally think the gold standard change was one of the worst things that the U.S. could have done for itself. The reason being, if no one here while you're listening to this really knows what the heck the gold standard is, let me try to quickly explain it to you. When a currency is based on a gold standard, that means that technically I can bring in a US dollar, right, or however many US dollars, to the bank, and they could technically give me an equivalent amount of gold for it. Like, it's backed by gold or a certain amount of hard value to it with mineral value. That is very good because your paper currency actually has some tie to a real thing like gold. And so it makes the currency much more stable, right? And so there's going to be a lot less high up and down deviations in terms of your currency price. It's going to be a lot more stable as growth kind of continues. Very similar to the British pound. And the British pound today is still based on the gold and silver standard. Once the US or any other country gets off of the gold standard and your currency, your paper currency, is just based off of nothing, that does give you a very quick boost to the economy, because you can suddenly print a lot more money because it's not based off of anything, and the economy can sort of like, go up again. Wages can go up. You're spending more money on projects and infrastructure and all these other various things. But the negative part is, like we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, the US government can just print trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars because it's just paper at this point. And, what are we going to do? Just in the last couple of years, because of COVID and the economic shutdown, we've printed many trillions of dollars. And so that is going to have real world ramifications in terms of inflation, in terms of pricing going up, in terms of the dollar being worth less. Because when you have more money in circulation, the money's worth less, right? By dollar. And so we're going to start entering into a phase, and probably currently in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the decades from now, today, where the US dollar is going to start being worth less. Inflation is going to go up. And that's very worrisome, because even my parents and I keep asking them questions. How was the Soviet Union before it collapsed? And so some of the inflation bits that we're seeing here in the US starts to scare my folks, because it's kind of similar to what they saw there before the nation was going down. But it was one of Nixon's final moves to get the U.S. off the gold standard. So we'll see whether it was a good move or not. I personally say it wasn't, but some of you might be future economists, so you might know better than me. And so those gas shortages started to increase as soon as the OPEC gas embargo started to occur, because the U.S. was so heavily involved in gas, or they needed fuel and oil from the Middle East. They were so reliant on it, and that was a huge issue in Nixon's presidency as well, because they kept asking him, well, we need to get off of our dependence on oil. What can we do, etc. And so, over time, Nixon did start to open up more gas and oil being drilled from the U.S., but it wasn't fast enough. So eventually, once OPEC in the Middle East just kind of embargoed us with oil, we were having gas shortages left and right. And so that has not happened ever since, because I think we've had contingencies put in place. And of course, the Middle East is not, kind of causing this kind of ruckus anymore because they want money. But yeah, that was definitely an interesting time for the U.S. And just goes to show that any nation should still be more or less self-reliant. You cannot just be 100% consumeristic, Because if the other countries just want to shut off trade for you, what the heck are you going to do? It's not a great feasible plan. This is a nice little snippet, only a few minutes long, of Richard Nixon and his sort of entire political career and life. And so a great little video to watch if you have the time for it. Now, let me take one last swig of coffee, and let's move into the Jimmy Carter / Iranian Revolution spotlight. Hope you guys are following along so far with our beloved Nixon. And now we're going to be moving into Jimmy Carter. A little bit of a less known president. He's not remembered as much in history, but still there. And so we'll do a little spotlight and discuss the Iranian Revolution a little bit, which is sort of combining some of my world history elements into the U.S., but important context for us to know leading up to the Iran-U.S. hostage situation that we had during the Jimmy Carter years. And even today, in the last few years, occasionally we'll have articles pop up of U.S.-Iran relations being strained, the U.S. doing embargoes on Iran for nuclear weapon testing, all of these various things. So just to put things into context of why U.S.-Iran relations are a little strained, right? And why so. So Jimmy Carter, U.S. president, of course, from 77 to 81. He was a Democrat. He was ex-Naval Academy, so, very buttoned-up type of gentleman. He was pro-deregulation, and so that was kind of his, I suppose, more conservative side as well. He wanted to remove regulations on many industries so the industries could actually regulate for themselves. The famous example of this was once the regulations started coming off a bit, the airline industry was able to restructure things so they could offer more seats on the flights, thereby making flights cheaper, but the quality decreased. So, you allow them to do what you got to do. The main sort of the main points of Jimmy Carter, I would say, were the man is considered sort of a peace mediator, right? He was just a mediator through and through. So if you want to remember him, he is the mediator. He was famous for his Camp David Accords with Israel and Egypt, brokering peace between the two. He was a very deeply moral, religious type of individual, very value-oriented guy. So even though he's a Democrat, I think he was the last Democrat to be pro-life, actually, if I remember correctly, the last Democratic president. He, was very sort of, like I said, mediator-oriented. So as soon as he came in, he wanted to lessen the amount of violence and war in the world. So as soon as he came into power, he was improving relations with China, ended our military support of the Nicaraguan dictator, agreed to give back the Panama Canal in 1999. So you wrote an agreement to finally end it in 99. Brought the Israeli Prime Minister and Egyptian President to Camp David to sign historic peace agreement talks. Unfortunately, the Egyptian president would be assassinated a couple years later for actually signing these peace agreement talks. And so the legacy known for Carter was his foreign policy engagement, trying to be the problem solver, fighting for human rights, and unfortunately, because of his views on human rights and trying to solve problems and be a mediator, unfortunately, his rivals politically saw him as soft. They saw him as not being tough enough militarily or tough enough with foreign powers in ways that they think he should have been. And so ultimately his legacy suffered because of the last thing on his docket, which was the Iranian hostage crisis. And we are going to get more into that. And so Jimmy Carter, although on paper, he was a very nice president, nice guy, made peace around the world, wasn't having the U.S. jump through hoops and hurdles in terms of joining any new wars. The Iranian crisis was sort of seen as him, just not being tough enough, right? And so here's Mr. Carter, look at him, handsome guy, great president, great mediator. I think he was probably, ahead of his time in terms of being nice to people. And so he just wasn't, probably respected as much as he would have been. I think today's generation would have liked Carter a lot because he just didn't want to get us involved in any more wars. Here's a couple of videos. The one on the left-hand side is a nice little short bio of the president and his life, and sort of his time at the Naval Academy, and kind of moving forward into politics. The video on the right-hand side is very interesting. It's just a short interview clip, but in there, the interviewer asks him, well, why didn't you send troops into Iran to save the hostages? And he quoted by saying, like, I could have wiped Iran off the map with the technology that we had at the time. He's like, I just did not want to start more war, And so he said in the video himself, he's like, sometimes it's easier to start war than it is to create peace, right? And so, ultimately he was not reelected for a second term, but I would agree with that. Sometimes not throwing the punch is harder to do than just throwing the punch. So let me quickly get a little snippet of Iranian history. And for this segment, in terms of U.S. history or whatnot, it's getting a little bit more into world history, but it's still kind of symbiotic, and it makes sense. So just bear with me. But hopefully, in case you're ever wondering why U.S.-Iranian tensions are a little strained, this is why. If we go back a few decades into the 50s, Iran had their leader, the Prime Minister Mossadegh. And so he was overthrown by U.S. CIA and UK MI6 intelligence agency. So the United States directly overthrew the Prime Minister, the leader of Iran, in the 50s. Okay? And Mossadegh was a very popular minister in Iran. The people liked him a lot because he nationalized the oil and petroleum industries, and he was working with Congress, with his parliament, to to start decreasing some of the powers, right, that the Shah and whatever else other folks were having in the country. So he was trying to be more sort of democratic, I suppose. But he was getting very strained with the U.S. and British because of him not wanting to be a player in the sense of having the oil reserves being exported very cheaply to foreign nations. And so what the U.S. ended up doing is spending a little bit of money that they had in order to incite violence, riots, and dismantling the Iranian government. So Mossadegh was eventually forced out. And the Iranians remember this. And so he was even on the Man of the Year, Time magazine, Mossadegh. And so that's how, much of a good player he was. The gentleman on the right-hand side was actually, he was a U.S. CIA operative. I believe he was the nephew of Theodore Roosevelt. And so he implemented this idea of putting money into a country and having them riot and revolt themselves. He's the one that placed that idea into the CIA's head. And so under the White Revolution, the U.S. was really stoking that revolutionary ideas. Iran quickly went from the Prime Minister Mossadegh into as they call it, the Shah. If you want the full name, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, but just the Shah. And so this was the U.S.-backed leader of Iran, who was very pro-Western, pro-oil, wanted to really work with the West and the CIA and the governments, etc. And so he was a very American choice, but the people ended up seeing him as a traitor. The people ended up seeing the U.S. as a very sneaky, traitorous country that was destabilizing their own. So bad blood is ensuing already, right? And over time, the Shah becomes more and more oppressive in terms of his police, and it starts to be a little more of a police state over time because he's just trying to crack down on let's say any type of protesters against his rule. But I will still say, for the most part, because he's more Western, the Shah here still has a lot more business-oriented, modernistic-oriented views, such as emancipation and enfranchisement of women, and land reforms, economic reforms, and such. So even though the Shah is more of a puppet of the U.S. and being pro-Western, there was some good that came from this, right? More education, more women's emancipation, business partnerships with the West, etc. So there is always good with the bad, not entirely just bad. But for the context of the Iranian people, especially the more revolutionaries and the radicals, the Shah is seen as just a traitorous son of a gun who is a puppet of the West. So eventually, as we move forward in the timeline, right, the Shah here sitting with JFK and then future presidents, right, being very pro-Western as he was, with his family. Here he is with LBJ, very pro-US, etc. Regal, right, very nice, very handsome, great family. Chetori, very nice. Eventually we have the revolutionary Khomeini, which is the Iranian sort of Shia Muslim religious extremist that he was. And so he ends up becoming the country's supreme leader. He ends up, essentially having a revolution, right? The Iranian Revolution, and kicking out the Shah and his family and instituting a very religious, conservative party, right? Focusing back onto their traditions of religion, their traditions of Sharia law, their traditions of Islam, right? And so what began as Khomeini's guerrilla rebel troops eventually just became a bigger and bigger revolt, a full-scale revolt. And many young people at the time were actually enlisting in this revolution, not necessarily because of Khomeini's Islamic ideals, but because so many young students in Iran at the time were reading Marxist ideals, were reading about revolutionary ideals, and so they looked at the Shah as a sort of more corrupt figure, especially with some of the police crackdowns they were having. And so I spoke to one Iranian Revolution actual member. So when he was a young student, it was my old professor at Cal State LA. When he was a young student, around 19 years old, he was part of the Iranian Revolution. And so I kept asking him, so why did you guys actually do this? He said there was an idea of, well, the Shah is, not doing the best job. He's a little abusive, etc. So if we overthrow the government, there's going to be hopefully a better government, right, with less abuse, a more pure government. However, as soon as all of the students and the youngsters helped Khomeini get into power, it turned into a much, much, much worse oppressive state than they could have ever imagined. So a completely failed experiment. So if any of you are ever pro-revolution or pro-rebellion, you never know what's going to come after that. So, take it with a grain of salt. Burning images of the Shah, right, during the revolution itself. Burning the U.S. flag because he's seen as a puppet of the U.S. Khomeini, his signs are being put up, right, because he's supposed to be the leader. And in the back, if you can tell, in the back there are posters of Marxist communists, right, from the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of ties there. And so Khomeini's ideology turns Iran into a very Islamic state, a Sharia law type of state, and wants to go completely against Westernization, completely against the United States, to protect Iran, to protect their God, to protect their way of life, and to oppose the Shah and any type of miserable wretches that came before him. And so, he promised the people the world and to bring back truth and justice and religious sort of scrutiny, but ended up being a horrible religious tyrant instead. And so that was a little bit of backdrop. And so as now you hopefully understand, the U.S. and Iran tensions are very, very, very tight due to the U.S. getting involved with the CIA, government overthrows, etc. As soon as Khomeini gets into power and Iran is the Islamic state that it is now, right, the very conservative religious state, a bunch of youngsters and students end up storming the U.S. embassy in the capital, Tehran, Iran, and seizing a lot of the folks in there and making them hostages. And so they were hostages for over a year. And this was in international news, U.S. news, of course. making U.S. headlines as well. And so, Carter is put in a very precarious position. Many folks want him to go to not necessarily full-scale war, but to use military force and to tell Iran, like, hey, give us our embassy members back. Because this is not something you typically do, right? The reason that numerous countries have embassies in other countries, it is a purely diplomatic building, right? They're off limits. You're not supposed to just go in and, kill off the embassy members or the ambassador to the country, right? If you've ever heard the old school phrase, hey, like, I'm going to give you a piece of news right now, but like, don't shoot the messenger, right? It's that kind of, situation. It stems from a very old tradition in ancient history of Greek and Persian, and maybe even going back as far as Mesopotamia, of you never shoot the messenger. The messenger is just there doing the work of the gods, right? And so it's not great to have them come into your house, so to speak, with good faith, and then you just slay them just for giving you news, right? And so regardless of that, so possible reasons for the Iranian students and revolutionaries for taking hostages. The bad blood between the U.S. and Iran causes this new culture of very anti-Westernization, anti-U.S. American sentiment, so growing hatred. America is seen as a foreign aggressor, threatening the livelihoods of Iranians and all of the Middle East. And so they are also impassioned by Khomeini's rhetoric, and they want to prove to themselves to the cause. So if they storm the embassy, maybe Khomeini and the government is going to see them and their families in a very positive light. So maybe they'll get some preferential treatment as well. So Carter's response to all of this, Iran asked for them to give the Shah back because the Shah and his family fled to the United States for protection and for medical purposes because the Shah was undergoing cancer treatments. The U.S. and Carter, they refused to give him back. They actually implemented something called Operation Eagle Claw to retrieve the hostages through military operation, which ended up being a failure. And so, people were looking at Carter more and more in terms of he's not a strong military leader. Thankfully, by the 1980 mark, Iran and Iraq entered into their own war. The U.S. used that as an opportunity to renegotiate some stuff with diplomacy and get the hostages back. And the hostages came back around the time when Ronald Reagan was being sworn into office. However, throughout all of this, Carter's legacy was tarnished a little bit because people saw him not getting, for over a year, those hostages back as him being weak, right? Or him not being a strong leader. And so over that year and a half, his approval ratings were over 50%, so he probably could have been reelected. And then they dipped down into the 40s or high 30s after that. And so his diplomatic response to this, instead of a more military response, was seen as weak, thereby thinning out his popularity enough to not win him a second term. And so here's a couple videos on the Iran hostage crisis for you to get a little bit more context and background into it. This one is more historical sort of footage from Tehran, from the storming of the embassy, right, etc. And some interviews, right, that they used to do. So great sort of historical footage for any of you to watch. Here's a photo of the storming of the embassy itself, right, with the signs of Khomeini in the right-hand side. The hostages themselves. And this is some of the response back here in the U.S. Deport all Iranians. Get the hell out of my country. So, America, just like any other time, whenever we have any issues abroad, people start to use that as an excuse to take it up against all types of groups of folks. So it's a very sort of uneducated thing to do, because obviously just because the country does something doesn't mean that all Iranians or all people of that country and necessarily are bad. People tend to forget that the United States is a nation of immigrants and a nation of all peoples. We are an experiment as far as the world history is concerned, and so we are a nation of all peoples, right? Kind of banding together with the unified ideals of the Constitution, the rule of law, certain societal elements that bind us together. People tend to forget that. And then eventually the hostages are brought back. This guy is so happy. He's like, yes, the torture has ended. But yeah, thankfully they were returned back. But poor Jimmy Carter. That was pretty much the end of his presidency on a bad note with a hostage crisis. Even though he finally got the hostages back, but his presidency kind of suffered because of it. And so since then, for the last couple of decades, he's just been. The best way I can describe him is just like he's been like Jesus, just working to help people, working for his Carter Work Project, Habitat for Humanity, going all around the U.S., going all around the world, and just building homes. Even now, into his old age, he's with his wife and with all of the different organizations that he works with, he's still building homes. And he's old. He's just giving back. He's not just retiring and sipping margaritas on some beach. He's working. He's trying to benefit humanity. So I truly think, Carter, in his ultimate legacy, he was just a very kind soul. He did not want war. He wanted to make peace, not instead of fighting. And so, people just did not necessarily see the merits of that. So, sort of, I guess, the right president at the wrong time, maybe. But yeah, he's a very kind and generous soul. Even here, this was a recent, the last couple years, 95 plus, he fell down, because, old people, they fall down occasionally, right? They have mishaps. Fell down, got himself a black eye, 14 stitches. So he's still healing, and he was back on the job site, making houses and building stuff. I mean, the man is just, he has a boundless heart. And so, end of chapter 30 there. I hope it was a good lecture. I hope it was a good one, covering Nixon, the rise and fall, the Vietnam War, some of the protests, the limits and potential abuses of executive privilege and the executive branch of the president. Jimmy Carter, some U.S.-Iran relations. So hopefully that you found that bit interesting. I incorporated some of those slides from my world history class. And I hope you did enjoy this section in part. And we're going to be slowly moving this coming week into Reagan, the closing off of the Cold War, and sort of modern topics with George W. Bush, Obama, right, etc. And so I really hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I will see you for the next one, folks. Thank you so much for staying here and listening, and take care.